The Milgram obedience experiment. Imagine sitting in a room with a machine covered in switches labeled Danger, Severe Shock, and XXX. A guy in a lab coat tells you to flip those switches, shocking someone in the next room every time they get a question wrong. The person begs you to stop, but the guy in the lab coat just says, "The experiment must continue." In 1961, Stanley Milgram wanted to find out what it takes for a normal person to follow a terrible command. Milgram was only 27 years old, an assistant professor at Yale University. He recruited 40 men through newspaper ads, postal clerks, high school teachers, salesmen, engineers, and paid them $4.50 to participate in what they thought was a study about memory and learning. The setup was simple, but brilliant. Each participant did a rigged drawing that ensured they always became the teacher. An actor always became the learner. The teacher's job was to administer electric shocks for wrong answers, using a generator with 30 switches ranging from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. The labels progressed from slight shock to danger, severe shock to just XXX. Here's the thing. The shocks weren't real. The screams were pre-recorded, but the participants didn't know that. At 75 volts, they heard grunts. At 120 volts, verbal complaints of pain. At 150 volts, the learner demanded to be released. At 300 volts, screaming. At 315 volts and beyond, ominous silence suggesting unconsciousness or death. The participants were sweating, trembling, having nervous breakdowns. 3 had full-blown, uncontrollable seizures. Many expressed verbal protests while continuing to flip those switches. One participant was so convinced he'd ended someone that he offered to return his payment. Before the experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists who predicted only 1% would go to the maximum voltage. They were way off. 65%, 26 out of 40 participants, administered the maximum 450 volt shock. 100% went to at least 300 volts. Regular everyday people are far more likely to follow horrifying orders than anyone expected. Give someone a lab coat and a clipboard, and suddenly, "I was just following orders," becomes a lot more believable. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, 24 college students signed up to get paid $15 a day to play pretend prison. These weren't hardened criminals or trained prison guards, just regular college guys picked through a coin flip to play different roles. The prison was just the basement of Stanford's psychology building. Within just 36 hours, these normal college students started turning into monsters. Philip Zimbardo, a 38-year-old psychology professor at Stanford, wanted to study how people behave when given power. He screened 75 applicants and selected the 24 most psychologically stable, middle-class students. A coin flip determined everything. 12 became guards, 12 became prisoners. The guards weren't just playing their roles anymore. Real Palo Alto police cooperated with the experiment, arriving at participants' homes to arrest the prisoners. They were fingerprinted, blindfolded, stripped, and deloused with deodorant spray. They were given smocks like dresses with no underwear, assigned numbers instead of names, and had chains locked around their ankles. The guards got khaki uniforms, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses. They were told to maintain order, but given no specific instructions. Just figure it out yourselves. Day 1 was relatively calm. Day 2, the prisoners rebelled, ripping off their numbers and barricading their cells. The guards responded with fire extinguishers. They created a privilege cell for non-rebels, using divide and conquer tactics. Guards started volunteering unpaid overtime just to assert control. By days 3 and 4, guards were forcing prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands, removing mattresses and making them sleep on concrete floors. Prisoner number 8612 had a complete breakdown, crying, screaming uncontrollably. Zimbardo initially thought he was faking. The breakdown was undeniable. The prisoner was released after just 36 hours. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. On day 6, Christina Masloch, Zimbardo's girlfriend and a psychology graduate student, visited the prison. Out of approximately 50 people who had observed the experiment, she was the only one to object. She told Zimbardo, "What you are doing to these boys is terrible." That morning, Zimbardo shut it down. 5 prisoners had been released early due to psychological distress. Zimbardo himself admitted he'd lost objectivity, thinking like a prison superintendent instead of a scientist. MK-Ultra Mind Control Program. The CIA funded secret mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens for 20 years. Mental patients, prisoners, and random civilians were dosed with rainbow papers without their knowledge or consent. Thousands of people became test subjects in a program that spanned 80 institutions across the United States and Canada. In 1953, the CIA launched MK-Ultra under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist nicknamed the Black Sorcerer. Gottlieb reported directly to CIA Director Allen Dulles and had unlimited funding to explore mind control techniques. One of his most prominent collaborators was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist who had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association and president of the World Psychiatric Association. This wasn't some fringe researcher. This was institutional authority at the highest level. The victims were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable. Mental patients who couldn't consent. Prison inmates who were captive populations. Addicts who were considered expendable. They were people unlikely to be believed if they reported what happened to them. Operation Midnight Climax involved CIA agents hiring prostitutes to lure men to safe houses in New York and San Francisco. The men were dosed with rainbow papers, while CIA operatives watched through two-way mirrors, taking notes on their behavior. But Dr. Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal was particularly brutal. Patients who came in for minor issues like anxiety or postpartum depression were put into drug-induced comas lasting weeks, sometimes up to 3 months. They were placed in sleep rooms where messages played 16 to 20 hours daily through speakers in their helmets or pillows. The same phrase would repeat hundreds of thousands of times. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered at 30 to 40 times normal power. The results were catastrophic. Patients emerged unable to recognize their own children. They couldn't read, write, or use the bathroom. Some developed permanent psychosis. Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, was given rainbow papers without his knowledge in 1953. 9 days later, he fell from a hotel window. The CIA initially ruled it self-deletion, but his family believes he was permanently removed because he knew too much about interrogation techniques. In 1973, Sidney Gottlieb ordered the destruction of most MK-Ultra records. Only 20,000 documents survived due to a filing error. Gottlieb retired and lived quietly until his death in 1999 at age 80. He never faced prosecution. Dr. Cameron died in 1967 before the program was exposed. The Little Albert Experiment. A 9-month-old baby loved playing with fluffy animals, especially a cute white rat. But scientists had other plans. In 1920, John B. Watson decided to prove that fears could be learned. Watson was 41 years old, a founder of behaviorism, and a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He'd previously served as president of the American Psychological Association. His research assistant was Rosalie Rayner, a 21-year-old graduate student who would later become his wife. Their test subject was Albert B., a 9-month-old baby boy whose mother worked as a wet nurse at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. They chose him specifically because he was stolid and unemotional. During baseline testing, Albert showed no fear of white rats, rabbits, dogs, monkeys, or cotton wool. He reached for the white rat with interest. Then, the conditioning began. Every time Albert reached for the white rat, someone struck a 4-foot steel bar with a hammer right behind his head. The noise was violently startling. Albert began to cry. They repeated this 7 times over 2 sessions. 1 week later, they continued. 5 more pairings of rat plus loud noise. By this point, Albert cried and tried to crawl away when the rat was presented without any noise at all. The fear didn't stop there. It generalized to anything white and fluffy. A rabbit made him scream. A fur coat made him scream. A Santa Claus mask with a white beard sent him into a panic. Even Watson's own gray hair triggered the fear response. Watson claimed he planned to decondition the fear, to undo the damage. But Albert's mother removed him from the hospital before this could happen. Watson never followed up. The baby was just sent home, traumatized. The true identity of Albert remains disputed. Some historians believe he was Douglas Merritt, who died at age 6 from hydrocephalus. Others think he was William Albert Barger, who lived to 87 and reportedly had a mild aversion to dogs throughout his life. But the story doesn't end with Albert. Watson had 4 children of his own with his wife Mary. He applied his behaviorist philosophy to all of them. No hugs, no kisses, minimal physical affection, strict schedules. His son John suffered from depression and attempted self-deletion. His daughter Mary battled alcoholism and made multiple self-deletion attempts. His son William also attempted self-deletion. His youngest son James committed self-deletion in his 40s. Watson wrote popular parenting books promoting his minimal affection approach, influencing an entire generation of parents from the 1920s through the 1950s. The monster study researchers actually called this the monster study among themselves. That should tell you everything you need to know. In 1939, Wendell Johnson, a 36-year-old professor of speech pathology at the University of Iowa, wanted to prove that stuttering was learned, not innate. Johnson himself had suffered from a severe stutter his entire life, and he was determined to validate his theory that stuttering develops when children are made anxious about normal speech disfluencies. He sent his 22-year-old graduate student Mary Tudor to the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport. There, she selected 22 orphan children between the ages of 5 and 15. They were the perfect subjects because they were a captive population with no parents to object or intervene. The children had no ability to consent or refuse. Tudor divided them into 4 groups. The most unethical was Group 2IB, 6 children with completely normal speech who were told they were beginning to stutter. Every hesitation, every repetition, every normal speech imperfection was criticized harshly. They were told, "Don't ever speak unless you can do it right," and "do anything to keep from stuttering." They were criticized in front of other orphans and instructed to stop talking if they felt they might stutter. The sessions continued every 2 to 3 weeks for 5 months. The children in the negative therapy groups became quiet and withdrawn. Those who had normal speech developed actual speech difficulties. Some refused to speak at all in certain situations. The personality changes were documented in Tudor's thesis. Children became shy, reserved, anxious about speaking. Johnson never published the results in a peer-reviewed journal. He knew what he'd done. Colleagues knew it as the monster study, acknowledging it was monstrous. But the study remained hidden for 62 years. In 2001, the San Jose Mercury News exposed the experiment. The University of Iowa issued a formal apology. Researchers located 3 of the surviving victims who confirmed the lasting impact. One had lifelong speech difficulties. Another had become extremely shy and withdrawn. The psychological trauma had persisted into old age. In 2007, the university settled a lawsuit, paying $925,000 to the 3 survivors. Johnson had died in 1965, his reputation intact until 36 years after his death. Mary Tudor expressed regret when contacted in 2001, saying she hadn't thought of the implications as a young graduate student. She died in 2006. The Aversion Project. The South African military didn't just experiment on homosexual soldiers. They subjected them to enhanced questioning with electric shocks, chemically castrated them, and performed forced gender reassignment surgeries for nearly 20 years. From 1971 to 1989, the South African Defense Force ran an official program to cure homosexuality. Dr. Aubrey Levin, a colonel and military psychiatrist, was the chief architect. He headed Ward 22 at Voortrekker-Hoogte Military Hospital in Pretoria, where an estimated 500 to 1,000 young soldiers were subjected to procedures they never consented to. South Africa had mandatory conscription for white males. The military allowed gay and lesbian conscripts to serve temporarily, not out of tolerance, but to prevent men from claiming homosexuality to avoid the draft. However, any soldier identified or suspected as homosexual was referred to military psychiatrists for treatment. The aversion therapy began with electric shocks. Soldiers were shown images of same-sex individuals, while electrodes were attached to their bodies. Shocks were administered repeatedly to create negative associations. When that didn't work, they moved to chemical treatments, experimental hormone cocktails designed to suppress homosexuality. The side effects included nausea, weight gain, and severe hormonal imbalances. But the most extreme cases received something far worse: forced gender reassignment surgery. The military's logic was grotesque. If gay men were attracted to men, surgeons would castrate them and create vaginas, making them women. Then the attraction would be heterosexual. Approximately 900 forced gender reassignment surgeries were performed, according to testimony at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many victims woke from surgery to discover what had been done to them. They had no say, no consent, no choice. The psychological consequences were catastrophic. Depression rates were extreme. Many victims committed self-deletion during or after treatment. Those who survived faced permanent physical changes, chronic pain, and lifelong trauma. Most were never able to form romantic relationships. In 1995, Dr. Levin fled South Africa to Canada. He continued practicing medicine in Calgary from 1995 to 2010, even serving as a court-appointed assessor for criminal cases. In 2010, he was arrested after 30 male patients came forward alleging he had assaulted them. He was convicted in 2013 and sentenced to 5 years, but served only 2 additional years beyond his pretrial detention. Dr. Levin was never prosecuted for the Aversion Project. He lives freely. The other military doctors faced no consequences. Harlow's Pit of Despair. Harry Harlow proved that babies need love to survive. His response? Create a chamber called the Pit of Despair and lock baby monkeys in total isolation for months. In the 1960s and 70s, Harlow ran a primate research lab at the University of Wisconsin. His earlier experiments had become famous. He'd proven that infant monkeys preferred a soft cloth surrogate mother over a wire mother that provided milk. The conclusion was groundbreaking. Babies need comfort and affection, not just food. Before this, many doctors told mothers not to spoil their babies with too much affection. But despite proving that love matters, Harlow escalated to something far worse. He created what he openly called the Pit of Despair, a steel isolation chamber where baby monkeys were confined in complete darkness. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. The stated goal was to create an animal model of depression, and it worked horrifyingly well. When the baby monkeys emerged, they were severely disturbed. They rocked constantly, engaged in self-harming behaviors, and couldn't interact with other monkeys. They were psychologically destroyed. When female monkeys who had been isolated were forced to breed, they became terrible mothers themselves, sometimes harming their own offspring. Harlow also created what he called a rape rack for breeding the traumatized females who couldn't mate naturally due to their psychological damage. Hundreds of monkeys were subjected to these experiments over the decades. Harlow himself suffered from depression and became an alcoholic. The experiments were eventually banned and helped launch the modern animal rights movement. The ethical cost was severe, but the work did contribute to understanding maternal deprivation. Harlow's findings were used to justify better conditions in orphanages and hospitals, ensuring human babies received physical affection and weren't left isolated in cribs for extended periods. But one has to ask, was the knowledge worth the suffering of hundreds of infant primates who were deliberately traumatized to prove what Harlow had already demonstrated, that babies need love? The Robbers Cave Experiment. Researchers took 22 normal 11-year-old boys to summer camp and deliberately turned them into warring tribes. The boys escalated to raids, flag burning, and physical violence. In 1954, social psychologist Muzaffar Sharif brought 22 middle-class 11-year-old boys to Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Their parents thought they were sending their sons to a normal summer camp. They had no idea their children would become subjects in an experiment designed to create tribal hatred. Sheriff divided the boys into two groups and kept them completely separate for the first week. Each group bonded independently, choosing team names: the Eagles and the Rattlers. They had no knowledge the other group existed. Then Sharif introduced them and immediately engineered competition. He created tournaments, contests, and situations specifically designed to increase hostility between the groups. It worked faster than anyone expected. The rivalry quickly turned hostile. The boys raided each other's cabins, destroying property and stealing belongings. They burned each other's flags. One group armed themselves with rocks stuffed into socks, preparing for potential violence. Physical fights broke out. The researchers had to intervene multiple times to prevent serious injuries. Throughout all of this, Sheriff and his team were actively manipulating situations to intensify the conflict. They weren't just observing natural group dynamics. They were engineering hatred between children who had been friendly and well-adjusted just days earlier. The experiment demonstrated how easily in-group and out-group psychology develops. Normal children with no prior animosity quickly learn to hate each other when placed in competitive tribal structures. It explains everything from sports violence to political polarization. Eventually, Sheriff had to engineer cooperation to reduce the hatred. He created situations where both groups needed to work together toward shared goals, fixing a water supply, pooling money for a movie. Gradually, the hostility decreased, and the boys began forming friendships across group lines. The parents were likely never fully informed about the true nature of the experiment. Their 11-year-old sons had been turned into experimental subjects in a study about manufacturing tribal warfare, all under the guise of summer camp. The learned helplessness experiments. What happens when you teach living beings that escape is impossible? Martin Seligman found out by restraining dogs and shocking them until they gave up trying. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania conducted experiments that would fundamentally change how we understand depression and trauma. But the path to that understanding involves severe animal suffering. Seligman restrained dogs in harnesses, so they couldn't escape. Then he administered electric shocks. No matter what the dogs did, struggle, bark, try to break free, nothing stopped the shocks. They were completely inescapable. After repeated sessions of this, Seligman moved the dogs to a different apparatus, a box divided into two sections by a low barrier. One side delivered shocks, the other side was safe. All the dogs had to do was jump over the small barrier to escape the pain. Dogs that hadn't been through the initial training figured this out immediately. They jumped to safety within seconds. But the dogs who had learned that escape was impossible just lay down and whimpered. Even though escape was now possible, even though they could see the safe side, they had learned that nothing they did mattered. They had given up completely. The dogs showed symptoms matching clinical depression in humans. They became passive, stopped eating, and lost interest in normal activities. Some never recovered normal behavior, even after the experiments ended. This became known as the theory of learned helplessness, and it revolutionized psychology. It helped explain why abuse victims don't leave dangerous situations, why depressed patients stop trying to improve their lives, and how trauma can create a sense of powerlessness that persists even when circumstances change. Seligman's work led to better treatments for human depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. He later became famous for pioneering positive psychology, focusing on human flourishing rather than pathology. But the ethical cost was significant. The experiments caused severe psychological suffering in animals to prove a point about human mental health. It remains one of the most controversial examples of animal research, raising questions about whether the knowledge gained justified the harm inflicted. The Good Samaritan experiment. Theology students were asked to prepare a sermon about the Good Samaritan, the parable about helping people in need. Then, researchers tested if they'd actually help someone suffering right in front of them. In 1973, psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson conducted an experiment at Princeton Theological Seminary. These weren't random college students. These were seminary students training to become ministers, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. The students were told to prepare a talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan, the biblical story where a traveler stops to help an injured stranger while religious leaders walk past without helping. After preparing their sermons, the students were sent to another building to deliver their talks. Here's where the experiment began. On their way to the other building, each student encountered a person slumped in a doorway, groaning and clearly in distress. The person was actually an actor, planted by the researchers. The critical variable was time pressure. Some students were told they were running late and needed to hurry. Others were told they had plenty of time. The results were disturbing. 63% of students who were told they were in a hurry stepped over the suffering person without stopping. Some literally stepped over a groaning victim to get to their appointment on time. And remember, these were people about to deliver a sermon on the moral importance of helping those in need. Even religious training, even actively thinking about helping others, even preparing to preach about the Good Samaritan, none of it mattered when situational pressure was applied. Being in a hurry overrode their moral values. The students who had time were much more likely to stop and help. The experiment demonstrated that situation overpowers personality and values. We're all capable of walking past suffering when we're under pressure, regardless of our beliefs or training. This experiment was less traumatic than the others on this list, but it's deeply revealing about human nature. It shows that hypocrisy isn't always intentional. Sometimes good people do bad things simply because circumstances push them to prioritize the wrong things. We'd all like to think we'd be the Good Samaritan. The evidence suggests otherwise.